There's a man in the White House who has spent his entire career weaponizing government power against anyone who isn't white, and Black America needs to understand that Stephen Miller views us as his ultimate enemy. Let me introduce you to Stephen Miller if you're not already familiar with this particular architect of modern American authoritarianism. He's not the loud, bombastic type who draws cameras and headlines. He's the quiet strategist working behind the scenes in the Trump administration, drafting executive orders, shaping policy, and systematically dismantling every protection that communities of color have fought decades to establish. And while much of the attention on Miller focuses on his extreme anti-immigrant positions, Black America needs to understand something critical. His ideology doesn't stop at the border. His vision for America is one where white people hold all institutional power, and that means Black Americans are directly in his crosshairs. Stephen Miller's origin story reads like a case study in radicalization, except he didn't start from a place of innocence and get corrupted. He started from privilege and deliberately chose white nationalist ideology as his guiding philosophy. Born in 1985 in Santa Monica, California, Miller grew up in a liberal, affluent community to a Jewish family. By all accounts, he had every advantage: economic security, educational opportunity, and a community that valued diversity and tolerance. And yet, he rejected all of it in favor of a worldview centered on white grievance and racial hierarchy. Even in high school, Miller was already displaying the characteristics that would define his career. He complained about having to pick up his own trash after lunch, arguing that it was taking jobs away from janitors. Think about the psychology of that for a moment. Here's a teenager from privilege who couldn't conceptualize performing basic tasks because he believed certain work was beneath him and should be reserved for other people, presumably people of lower status. That's not just laziness. That's an early manifestation of a worldview built on hierarchy and entitlement. At Duke University, Miller's trajectory became even clearer. He wrote columns for the school newspaper railing against multiculturalism, affirmative action, and what he perceived as anti-white bias. He organized events protesting diversity initiatives. He built relationships with prominent conservative figures who recognized in him someone who would say the things they believed but couldn't always say publicly. He was building his brand as the young, intellectual face of white nationalism, someone who could articulate racist ideology and policy language that sounded legitimate to people who wanted plausible deniability for their prejudice. After college, Miller worked for several Republican politicians, including Michelle Bachmann and Jeff Sessions, both known for their extreme conservative positions. But it was his connection with Sessions that really shaped his policy approach. Sessions had spent decades fighting against civil rights legislation, opposing voting rights protections, and using his position in the Senate to block anything that would advance racial equity. Miller absorbed this approach and refined it, understanding that the most effective way to implement discriminatory policy wasn't through explicitly racist language, but through neutral-sounding legislation that produced racist outcomes. When Donald Trump announced his presidential campaign in 2015, Miller saw his opportunity. He became one of Trump's earliest and most devoted advisors, helping craft the speeches and policies that would define the campaign. He understood something fundamental about American politics. There was a significant portion of white America that was angry about demographic change, resentful about perceived losses of status and power, and eager for a leader who would promise to restore the racial hierarchy they believed was natural and correct. Miller's villain arc, as you perfectly described it, is really about the evolution from being a provocateur writing controversial op-eds to becoming someone with actual governmental power to implement his ideology. As a senior advisor to the president, Miller has access to the levers of power that can shape policy across every federal agency. He's not just talking about his beliefs anymore. He's encoding them into executive orders, agency directives, and legislative proposals that have real consequences for millions of people. Now let's talk specifically about why Black America needs to be watching Stephen Miller with extreme vigilance. While immigration policy has gotten most of the media attention, Miller's worldview and policy agenda directly target Black communities in ways that are equally dangerous and often more insidious because they receive less public scrutiny. Miller has been a driving force behind efforts to dismantle affirmative action and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across federal agencies and federal contractors. He views these programs not as necessary corrections to historical discrimination, but as anti-white discrimination. In his Miller's worldview, any policy that specifically helps Black Americans is inherently unfair to white Americans, regardless of centuries of structural racism that created the disparities these programs attempt to address. He's worked to eliminate DEI offices, ban diversity training that acknowledges systemic racism, and remove any federal support for programs that aim to increase Black representation in employment, education, or business opportunities. Think about what this means practically. Federal contracts worth billions of dollars that previously had requirements to consider minority-owned businesses are being stripped of those provisions. Federal agencies that had programs to recruit and promote Black employees are eliminating those initiatives. Universities that receive federal funding are being pressured to end consideration of race in admissions. All of this bears Miller's fingerprints, and all of it directly harms Black Americans' ability to access economic opportunities and educational advancement. Miller has also been instrumental in efforts to roll back civil rights enforcement across federal agencies. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, which is supposed to investigate and prosecute discrimination, has been redirected under his influence to focus on what he frames as discrimination against white people. Instead of investigating police departments with patterns of brutality against Black communities, the DOJ has investigated universities with affirmative action programs. Instead of prosecuting housing discrimination that keeps Black families from accessing certain neighborhoods, they've gone after diversity initiatives in corporate hiring. This isn't accidental. This is strategic reorientation of federal power away from protecting Black Americans and toward protecting white Americans from any policies that might redistribute power or resources. Miller understands that civil rights enforcement is one of the few tools the federal government has to counteract systemic racism, so neutering that enforcement is essential to his broader agenda of maintaining white dominance. Let's also examine Miller's role in pushing legislation and executive actions that criminalize protest and dissent. After the Black Lives Matter protests following George Floyd's murder, Miller was among those advising the hardline response, advocating for federal intervention and prosecution of protesters. He views Black political mobilization as a threat to order, which really means a threat to the existing racial hierarchy. A Black population that is organized, vocal, and demanding change is exactly what Miller's ideology cannot tolerate, because it challenges the vision of a white-dominated society that he's working to preserve and strengthen. Miller's influence extends to judicial appointments as well. He's been involved in vetting and recommending judges who share his ideological perspective, judges who will uphold restrictive voting laws that disproportionately impact Black voters, judges who will rule against civil rights claims, judges who will interpret the Constitution in ways that limit federal power to address discrimination. These lifetime appointments will shape civil rights law for generations, long after Miller himself leaves government. This is perhaps his most dangerous legacy because it embeds his ideology into the third branch of government where it's hardest to dislodge. Here's what makes Miller particularly dangerous from a psychological and strategic perspective. He's a true believer. He's not someone who adopted these positions for political convenience or financial gain. He genuinely believes in white supremacy as an organizing principle for society. That level of ideological commitment means he's not subject to the normal political pressures that might moderate someone else's positions. He's not worried about being called racist because he's redefined racism in his mind as anything that advantages non-white people. He's not concerned with his legacy in traditional terms because he believes history will vindicate him. This true believer mentality also means he's playing a long game. He's not just focused on what can be accomplished in one administration. He's building networks, mentoring younger conservatives who share his views, creating policy templates that can be implemented whenever Republicans control government, and working to shift the entire conservative movement further toward explicit white nationalism. He's patient, strategic, and utterly committed to his vision. Black America needs to understand that Miller views us with particular hostility because we represent everything his ideology opposes. We are visible, vocal, organized, and increasingly politically powerful. We have demonstrated throughout American history that we will fight for our rights and our dignity regardless of the consequences. We have cultural influence that extends far beyond our numbers. We have produced leaders, movements, and ideas that have fundamentally challenged white supremacy. In Miller's worldview, we are not just a problem to be managed. We are the primary obstacle to achieving his vision of a white-dominated America. This is why his policy agenda consistently targets the mechanisms through which Black Americans have gained power and voice. Voting rights restrictions disproportionately impact Black voters. Eliminating affirmative action reduces Black representation in elite institutions. Defunding civil rights enforcement removes accountability for discrimination. Criminalizing protests suppresses Black political mobilization. Removing diversity requirements limits Black economic advancement. Every single one of these policies serves the same goal: reducing Black Americans' ability to challenge white dominance. Now, Miller is smart enough not to explicitly state these goals in racial terms most of the time. He talks about merit, about fairness, about colorblind policy, about law and order, about protecting American culture. These are all coded terms that allow him to pursue racist outcomes while maintaining plausible deniability about racist intent. But Black America has centuries of experience decoding this language. We know that merit means preserving white advantages. We know that fairness means maintaining the status quo. We know that colorblind means ignoring ongoing discrimination. We know that law and order means controlling Black communities. We know that American culture means white culture. The question becomes, what do we do with this knowledge? How does Black America respond to someone like Stephen Miller, who has both ideological commitment to our oppression and governmental power to implement it? First, we name him. We make sure that Black communities know who he is, what he believes, and what he's doing. Too often, figures like Miller operate in relative obscurity, while the more visible personalities draw all the attention. We cannot let him work in the shadows. Every policy he influences, every executive order he drafts, every appointment he supports needs to be exposed and connected back to his broader agenda. Second, we organize opposition to his specific policy initiatives. When he pushes to eliminate affirmative action, we mobilize legal challenges and public pressure. When he works to restrict voting rights, we fight in courts and state legislatures. When he redirects civil rights enforcement, we document the impact and demand accountability. We cannot stop everything, but we can impose costs and create obstacles that slow down his agenda and limit its reach. Third, we build alternatives and protections at state and local levels. If federal civil rights enforcement is compromised, we strengthen state-level protections. If federal programs that support Black communities are eliminated, we create community-based alternatives. We cannot rely on the federal government to protect us when people like Miller control it, so we build power and institutions that exist independent of federal support. Fourth, we invest in political power to ensure that people like Miller cannot maintain influence indefinitely. We vote, we organize, we fundraise, we run for office, we build coalitions. We make it politically costly for any administration to embrace his ideology and empower his policy agenda. We demonstrate that there are consequences for attacking Black communities. Fifth, we prepare for the long fight. Miller is young, he's committed, and he's building a movement. This isn't going to be resolved in one election cycle. We need sustained attention, sustained organization, and sustained resistance for years or decades to come. We need to raise a generation of Black young people who understand the threat, recognize the tactics, and are prepared to fight back. The bottom line is this: Stephen Miller represents the most dangerous strain of American racism, the kind that is intelligent, strategic, patient, and committed to using governmental power to enforce white supremacy. He's not a relic of the past. He's an architect of a possible future where Black Americans are systematically excluded from power, opportunity, and voice. Black America cannot afford to ignore him, to underestimate him, or to assume that someone else will deal with him. He is targeting us specifically and deliberately, and our response must be equally specific and deliberate. We must keep our eyes on Stephen Miller, understand his methods, oppose his agenda, and ensure that his vision for America never becomes reality.